Supply is supply. Any units you add, it doesn't matter. It's good.
Hello, and welcome to Housing Insiders, the podcast for founders, builders, lenders, and regulators, and anyone who believes that everyone should be well housed. I'm Jonathan Lawless.
And I'm Jeremy Potter. On Housing Insiders, we're hosting the conversations you won't hear anywhere else about how to make housing more innovative and attainable.
Hey, we're really excited to partner with Built Rewards to bring you these smart conversations. Of course, if you have an idea for a guest or a show or want to sponsor, hint, hint, please email us at podcast@thehousinginsiders.com.
And if you like the show, please give us the review, share it, spread the word. We want to bring you more episodes just like this one.
Super excited today to introduce our guest. It is Hugh Frater, former CEO of Fannie Mae, my former boss. Hugh has had such an impressive career in finance, and particularly housing finance. Founding partner, managing director at BlackRock, was an EVP at PNC Financial Services, where he led the real estate division. And of course, at Fannie Mae, all of us really appreciated his calm, approachable demeanor and his regular appearances with his guitar.
Not too shabby, Hugh. That's amazing. Thank you so much for being here. Hugh, you're currently the chairman of the board at Vessel Technologies. So before we get into any other big topics, anything else going on, I know we'll talk a little bit about the outlook for the new administration in the next year, but what we thought is we would just start with Vessel Technologies. We want to hear more about it. So tell us a little bit about what's going on in that role and that company.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for the question. One of the things that has always been part of the challenge in delivering housing that's attainable is trying to figure out how to add more productivity to the construction process. It seems to me the typical approach to create attainable and affordable housing is to add subsidies. We could argue about whether that promotes innovation or not. I tend to think it doesn't. But setting that to the side, the construction industry hasn't really experienced changes in productivity in 50 years. There have been some...
I thought it was 50,000 years.
Maybe 50,000 years. Now, there are people that would argue that those statistics are slightly misleading because the cost of land was increasing during that period of time. But regardless, there has not been significant innovation. But there has been a lot of attention paid to modular housing, and there are some people that would say that the road to hell has been paved with failed modular companies. The companies that have, and there are some big names that have tried and have failed, but if you really turn on the Wayback Machine a little bit, you might remember that Sears had a kit house. And actually, it was a successful product. It can be done, and there have been innovation in fits and starts. But what we have done at Vessel Technologies is study some of the notable failures. I'm not going to go through them because I don't want to embarrass anyone, but they were all, in our analysis, were plagued by several things. One, the venture industry, as you know, sort of moves in waves, and it goes from fintech to proptech to AI it rotates to whichever sector seems to have the most promise and is the hottest. When they come upon a hot sector like they did for a period of time in proptech, they tend to throw a lot of money because they've got a lot of money capital to deploy. They tend to throw a lot of money at companies. The common thread in the modular failures has been they raise too much money from venture capital. They never paid enough attention to costs, and they always underestimated how hard it was to get their products to market. And there were some terrific concepts. And some of them are still sort of been recast and recapitalized and are out there doing good work. But from the very beginning, our view was there are only three inputs to the construction process. There's cost of labor, cost of materials, and cost of capital. Setting cost of capital to the side for a moment, the virtue of a well-managed manufacturing process, and as we can apply the same thing to housing, is you really pay very, very detailed attention to where every single penny goes and how it gets spent. And so if you think about a panelized approach, which is what we take, we significantly save on labor costs, both in the factory and on site. We significantly reduce materials waste. And because of the fact that we're staging production, you can be staging production in a parallel fashion with site work going on while the structure has actually been being built.
Can I ask of those things that you just mentioned, because this is a story we hear from a lot of offsite construction companies, is that they're trying to tackle these costs, but where have you found the most juice for the squeeze? Or is it kind of what I'm hearing from you is you can't expect creative labor solution to win the day. You've got to literally be on top of each and individual component, or is there one area that you
have to.
feel like?
There's no, as you know, there's no silver bullet. But for instance, if you use the panelized approach that we have taken, we've got a very, very simple, elegant design. You could be, if you're one of our workers, and we've got some terrific people in our factory, and we are vertically integrated. A week before, they could have been running a fryer at McDonald's, and we can teach them how to assemble a panel. And there's a very, very simple process to follow. Our ultimate objective, and we're getting closer to it every day, is to have a vessel system be the same as an IKEA set of drawers, where you get a set of, maybe there's words, maybe there aren't, but there are pictures, there are instructions, an instruction set which can be used by anybody to assemble
I'll just
a
say in
building.
my IKEA building experience, you do not want me close to that Allen wrench. But
Look, I
you have
understand. I've had the same
drawers.
experience trying to assemble an IKEA set of drawers myself. But the point being that we're saving substantially on labor in the factory, and then we're also saving on site. And it's not the reason for that. And these are things you're familiar with. There's conduit that's already in the walls. All of the outlets are pre-stamped. There's a set of plumbing risers which clip together. And so the amount of time per unit that the electrician or the plumber who is is at prevailing wage, the amount of time that they have to spend per unit is substantially reduced. So we're saving labor in the factory, we're saving materials as waste, and we're saving on site as well. And when you add the time element, then that obviously leads to savings, fairly significant savings in cost of capital and construction interest, for instance. And so I think there may be further cost of capital savings. That's TBD, depending on how the agencies and the financing sources respond to the product over time. But you really have to think about all three. And one of my issues, again, this is not meant to be a random slap at a successful program, but in LIHTC as an example, again, one of the simultaneously most successful government programs of all time, and maybe one of the most inefficient as well. But there's no natural incentive to save money. Whereas if you look at, and the modular companies which have not been successful, they were not counting nickels and dimes. And you have to do that. And that's a discipline, frankly, that if you think about some of the old time developers, and the person that comes to mind in New York City would be Sam Lefrak. He knew where every single penny was spent on every job that he did. And that's something which, is easy to say. It's hard to do in practice. It takes a certain amount of discipline. But I think if you combine a simple, elegant design with that discipline, then you can really achieve some results.
Yeah, and it's. I mean, the other thing about it is it's dreadfully boring, and something that venture capitalists aren't really excited about. Oh, I'm going to invest in this company who's really thoughtful about the cost of copper wiring, right? So can you talk about the financing part? I mean, so you talked about the cost of inputs and things like that.
Yep.
Something that Jeremy and I talk a lot about is just the real disjoint between venture and real construction. Right. A lot of these things take a long time, and they're not high margin, high velocity businesses. They're the wrong source of capital. But how do you guys think about capitalizing? And then we'd love to hear land as well as kind of the third category.
Yeah, so I think the we debated long and hard about whether or not to we're sort of fairly traditionally financed with a founder putting up a bunch of money, and then a group of angels, of which I was one, coming in at that next level, and debated a lot about doing a Series A with traditional venture capitalists. We, in the end, partnered with people who we knew well, who also had some connectivity to the prop tech space and the industry. So the Lennox division of Lennar is one of our investors. Terrific people, and obviously know the space well, and have made investments in similar companies. And then a group called General Mosaic, somebody that we knew pretty well and who knows the prop tech space well. And what we did was we really just tried to raise the least amount of money that we could, and to get us to the point where we could see a fairly clear bridge to cash flow positivity. And we're well on that journey, and I expect we will be there within 6 months. If not sooner. At the corporate level, our financing needs have been fully met. It's really then the question is, how do your financing sources deal with the asset level? And our experience has been very positive. Well, we have kind of three business models. One is we are vertically integrated and act as a developer and the owner. Then One would be that we act as the developer and deliver to an owner, and the third would be we simply act as a general contractor and deliver to a developer or an owner who's going to do with that asset whatever they wish. But in any event, we've spent a lot of time with the construction lending community, also with the agencies on the takeout side. And after some back and forth, and by the way, I give these lenders a lot of credit. They have been involved in modular deals or prefabricated deals that did not work. And so I give them a lot of credit for being willing to step to the plate again. What they after sort of some exposure to us and to what we're doing, they got very comfortable that we could deliver the asset in a pretty short period of time relative to what they're used to, maybe half to a quarter of the time they were used to. And that's kind of a good news, bad news story. It's good news for the credit folks because they don't have that much. Their exposure isn't outstanding for that long. It's good news for us because we're paying less construction interest, and it's bad for them because they're not earning more construction interest. So it's kind of an interesting dilemma. But you pair that with the way that the agencies look at and the owners that they would finance the look at the product, and I've been I wouldn't say surprised. I've just been pleased with the way they've looked at it because we are delivering attainable housing. We're not using multiple subsidy layers. We're not using any subsidy at all. And the fact that we can deliver workforce and check those boxes for them, we're delivering housing that is attainable, that is sustainable, almost net zero, with really high quality in-unit amenities. So we're delivering Class A housing at a Class B rent or thereabouts.
Amazing.
And so,
Amazing.
Again, it's. I wish it was more complicated because that would make it more sexy. But as when our investors had done a lot of diligence, they said, what you guys are doing is so simple. Why doesn't everybody do that? To which my answer is, well, they should. And I think that there should be plenty of imitation and innovation in similar fashions. Just like in 1920, there was 200 car companies. The car was a good idea, and I think that people will adopt. We tend to believe that maybe we'll be proven wrong, but we tend to believe that panelized makes more sense than volumetric modular. And it's for a variety of reasons. One of the simplest to understand is just the transportation side of things, because there's really no limit to where we can ship.
Yeah, Hugh, you mentioned the fact that some of the best innovation we've seen in any industry, but particularly this industry, is the obvious one where people look back on it and go, oh, we could have done that. We should have done that. And the fact is doing it is the whole ball game. I'm curious, you mentioned some of this timing aspect where other lenders, other participants had tried something and it didn't work. And timing is a big factor here. Can you talk a little bit about what units you're producing, the ones you mentioned, the sustainable, attainable at cost, in the density category? Are they multifamily?
Yeah. So we're a one trick pony right now. I mean, we're building 50 to 70 unit multifamily buildings, going up 3, 4, 5 stories depending on local codes. We can and we've been learning a lot as we go through each build. We've got about between 500 and 600 units in various stages of development right now. Currently, all in the state of Connecticut. I expect our next transactions, next deals will be in Florida and in New Jersey, probably next. And if we had time, we could get into some of the zoning changes that put the wind at your back at these sorts of developments. But our current product is conventional multifamily. Everything is photovoltaic on the roof. Everything's got triple glazed windows. Everything, the structures are super tight. Everything has elevators. One of the approaches to attainable housing is to do 2 and 3 story walk-ups, which I think is a perfectly good way to do it using traditional techniques. But we actually think that having the elevators having an elevator is important from an accessibility point of view. As we master that product set, and that really is the key. It's continuous improvement. Each time you do it, you have to get better, and you have to get faster, and you have to get cheaper. But the other applications of what we're doing, the other verticals, student housing is an obvious one. We think that the sort of light densification, which I think is what you'll see a lot of, whether it's quads and triplexes, things like that, we think that's a logical one. We think there could be disaster recovery applications. I think there's an enormous opportunity set, but even if all we did was build unsubsidized workforce housing in Connecticut and Florida, we'd do very, very well. No matter how hard we work, we think it'll be hard for us to really exhaust the amount of demand that's there, but I don't see any reason why we couldn't, just in the conventional space, be building thousands and thousands of units a year.
This episode is brought to you by Built Rewards. Built is a rewards program, just like an airline program that is centered around your home and neighborhood. But instead of earning miles for flying, Built rewards you for paying rent, no matter how you pay. As a member, you can earn points at over 20,000 local restaurants, local merchants, and those points are now the most valuable rewards currency. You can use it to book travel, on Amazon, or even towards a down payment.
Built is revolutionizing housing. If you want to learn more, email John at lawless@builtrewards.com.
That's amazing. I mean, congratulations for all that you've done there. I'm curious, and actually, one of the things I often say to housing policy folks is that if all the people talking about housing supply would just go out and start building houses, we wouldn't have a housing supply problem. And so, I'm very impressed that you have in fact just kind of went and did that. But housing supply was something we talked a lot about at Fannie Mae. I mean, it's been a conversation that we've had for years. I'm curious to know, like, since you've been working with Vessel, has your thoughts about the challenges changed? Have you seen anything different, or is it simple as like just go and build homes?
It's a very interesting question because there's no doubt, supply is the answer, and easing the path to the creation of more supply is the answer. I must admit, I'm of two minds as to whether it should be denser multi-unit rental housing or whether it should be single-family housing. I have some views on whether the amount of subsidy that we direct towards ownership is properly directed. I mean, that's a policy question. But no matter what, my friend Lori Goodman, who you probably know, supply is supply. Any units you add, it doesn't matter. It's good. And so then the question in my mind becomes, well, what are the permitting or zoning regimes that enable the creation of more housing, and how do you facilitate it? And any developer will tell you that time is their enemy, and time kills all deals. And so I actually do know a great friend of mine controls a lot of land in San Diego. They've not been able to build a single thing on it for 20 years.
Wow.
And that, I don't know, excuse me, I was about to swear, it's not a very good investment, let's put it that way.
And you're welcome to tell the truth here.
And so I think that's just a sort of particularly egregious example. Then you see in parts of California, in other words, the poster child for a lot of stuff, sadly, the amount that it costs to build a subsidized affordable unit, $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 a door. And I sort of, simplistically say, well, geez, we could deliver 4 units for that. Why wouldn't you just do that? Well, and the answer is because there's all these different requirements and all these different impact fees, and you just keep adding all that stuff up. So I do think, and whether it's realistic or not, I mean, politics is the art of the possible. So there's things that you can say on a show like this, and then actually getting stuff done is a different, sometimes a different thing. But I do think that one of the key things, I don't think we should be promoting homeownership per se. I think we should just be finding ways to deliver more housing without regard to whether it's rental or for sale. I think that one of the key attributes of whatever housing policy comes next, and I think there's an opportunity. I think the Harris folks are a little more focused on it than the Trump administration, but I do think the Trump administration will be focused on it, is how to find whether it's incentives or ways to encourage municipalities and states to densify. And you have to work, as I guess Jenny Sheets from Brookings would say, work with the coalition of the willing. There's probably no amount of money that you can, I don't want to pick on anyone in particular, but there's no amount of money that you can point at New Canaan, Connecticut that's going to get them to get them to want to densify. I'm sure my friends in New Canaan will give me a call. But but I think there are examples in red states and blue states of forward-looking zoning regimes that have really started to get some traction and make a difference. It'll probably be a mix of things where, for instance, you've probably heard people talk about, both campaigns talked about this, the amount of federal land that is available in different places.
And 30% I think of the country is federal land.
And in some states, it's as much as 80%. Now, some of that is sort of Smokey the Bear country, and it's not going to be, necessarily useful for housing. But other places, it could, even if it's just a fraction of that available land, that could be granted from the feds to the state, provided they agree to certain density requirements. And so if they're single family, 75% of the land in the country is zoned single family, right? Something like that.
Right.
You take that land which previously was not available in Utah, let's say. I mean, Spencer Cox has been very forward looking on this stuff. Take that land and say, okay, we're going to gift it from the federal government to the state of Utah, but here are the requirements. Here's what you have to agree to in terms of the density that you're going to allow on that piece of land. Part of the deal will be the state will have to build the infrastructure if there's infrastructure needed, whether it's water and sewer, whether it's highway or whatever. And so I think there are some really interesting things that can be done that will enable the and it has to be the private sector. I mean, the federal government will have a role to play, the state government will have a role to play, but you really have to engage the private sector. It's not a knock on. There's a lot of super dedicated people in the not-for-profit sector, but the private sector has to be engaged, because I think profit motivation will make them move quickly.
Yeah, and what it sounds like, I mean, just as your answer seemed to really revolve around the main friction being land, just available land to build. If there's land to build, people will build it, and they'll build it well, they'll build it cheap, they'll build it plentiful. But at the end of the day, until there are places to build, we're not going to have more supply.
But you said, and I agree, but that supply can come in several forms. So one would be federal land that is owned by the feds and has never been available for this. But there's also land in Miami, which before Live Local wasn't available to build on because it was zoned industrial, as an example. Well, if you say, if it's 71 units and it has these amount of attainable units, then as of right, you can build multifamily. And that's very, very powerful. And what I always go back to, and maybe the numbers aren't quite as dramatic as I'm about to articulate, but if you had a piece of land that was zoned single family residential and you wanted to build a house on it, well, 99% of the time, if you showed them some plans that were consistent with the code, you get approved. Okay, if you have a piece of land that's zoned multifamily, well, 99% of the time you have to have a public hearing. Okay, right. Why is that? I can think of plenty of reasons, none of them are good. So I think that these kinds of, at the state level, and Florida's not a deep blue state, obviously, but they recognize that they have a shortage of housing, and that kind of change has an immediate impact. And we've seen it directly. We've seen it directly in the state of Florida. What makes our vessel product particularly suited to it is we don't need a big assemblage. So we could be in a neighborhood that's got 10,000 acre parcels. We can build 50 homes on 10,000 square feet. We can build 50 units on 10,000 square feet. That's in an urban environment where if you've got the right product, simply being able to go as of right rather than have to go through the whole hearing process frees up that same land.
And it sounds like you're taking a very holistic view of housing as an economic engine, housing as a stability mechanism in the community where you put it. But it seems like a lot of times when we get into those city council meetings, we get into those public hearings, we get into especially the density conversation, the conversation narrows very quickly to just not my backyard or just about the literal housing structure. Is there any advice you have for our community innovators, housing policy folks, to kind of continue to help public officials pull back the lens and capture the economic conversation you just had, to really bring in those other factors? Because it seems like that gets lost a lot.
We've rarely in our development efforts, and we're mainly in the state of Connecticut, obviously, which benefits from a state statute 8-30G, which unless your community has met their affordable obligations, which is not capital A, it's workforce 80 to 120%. Unless you've met your as they define it, affordable obligations, then a developer can go and buy a single family lot, and as of right, they can build multifamily. The state or the town, there's one appeal and one appeal only. So what we have tended to do is we've identified communities where they have not met their obligation. We've gone and talked to the town officials, the mayors. In the majority of cases, they say, we know we need the housing and we want the housing. Let's just have a conversation about where it should go, where it's most consistent with the character of the community. And so we're building in Avon and Simsbury, which are well-to-do suburbs of Hartford, and I think we're building the first workforce housing that's been built there in a really long time. The towns have been great because they know they need the housing, and so I think if you said we're going to bang our heads against the wall, and again, I'll offend my friends in New Canaan, but don't do it. It's just not worth it. There's plenty of places that know that they need the housing, and so work with the, again, to use Jenny's phrase, the coalition of the willing.
I might disagree a little. I'll maybe say it in a way that makes it sound like I agree a little bit more. So Jeremy's point is basically,
you don't have to.
It's basically the people that are making these decisions at the town hall meetings don't know what's best for them. In fact, they're making a decision based on one thing, but they're losing on a bunch of other things. So one might say, well, actually, maybe people do know what's best for them, and they do. If they don't want people to build housing near them, then don't build housing near them. I'll sort of, maybe the Trump campaign, I think Trump sort of shied away from this language, but very early on, he said, we have beautiful suburbs. We need to protect the suburbs, was kind of his pitch, which I think probably resonated with a lot of NIMBYs across the country. But I hear a story like yours in California where it takes 20 years to build, and they're just basically saying, we don't want you to live here. So should we say, okay, we'll go live somewhere else?
I think that's perfectly legitimate. I think so. There's two parts to what you were saying. One is there has been language. There was language in the Trump policy position on housing relating to single family zoning, and I think there's a wing of the Republican Party that feels like the YIMBY movement is a Democratic attempt to mess with Republican suburbs. And again, politics is my lane, but I think that's probably part of what it was. But when you're actually on the ground, what you find, and again, look at two of the most forward-looking zoning regimes in the country are in Florida and Montana. These aren't beacons of like left-wing, left-wing whateverism. And so the reason they are that way is because they know they need the housing. And they've wrapped their heads around it. Now, ironically, and I may offend some people when I say this, if you look at the trades, the big trades, the home builders, the mortgage bankers, the realtors, I would bet you dollars to donuts that the vast majority of those folks are probably Republican. But they are all in favor, as best I can tell, they're all in favor of adding to the housing supply.
Yeah,
because why not? I mean, it's more money in their pockets.
It's good for business. That's for
good for business, and the business of America is business.
That's right. Well, I think they're definitely yes in your backyard. Is there
right? Yes, not mine. Yours, fine. Yeah, I like it. But it'll be really interesting to see, because what I think will happen in Florida under Live Local is, and we've already seen a little bit of this, people will realize that their piece of land, their single family zoned lot, is actually worth more if you can put multifamily on it. And so that's going to be an interesting dynamic, unless you've already built some like Taj Mahal on it, and then you'll get wedded to the value of that. But the land itself will be worth more.
So let's pivot to one last policy issue that I'd love to get your thoughts on, and that's GSE reform. We spent a lot of time talking about it when we were at Fannie Mae. It's pretty clear that the Trump administration is going to be thinking about it again. And before I really get into exactly what GSE reform could look like and getting your thoughts on that, one of the things that happened during the 80s, you're probably familiar with this, is that when the savings and loan crisis was happening and people were struggling to raise financing for building, the GSEs actually stepped in at that time and provided financing for acquisition, development, construction. Whether or not this administration would even contemplate doing that with the GSEs, I'd be curious to get your thoughts. Are the GSEs a place that we should maybe consider, increasing liquidity for construction?
It's a complicated question, and it's a good one, because going back to the beginning, we talked about the basic elements in the construction process: materials, labor, cost of capital. I do think there's a role to play for the federal financing sources to help lower the cost of capital for new development, and I think that will have a positive effect on the margin. There have been some ideas floated around, out there around taking construction preferred positions or mezz positions, however you describe it legally. There will be people within the administration and the relevant agencies that have PTSD over what happened in the 80s. Obviously the savings and loan crisis was a result of the savings industry getting deregulated and trying to earn their way out of their problems by going into all sorts of things they didn't know that much about. And that, of course, led to the only time in history, I think, that you had 2 years of negative returns in the real estate market, which I think was 90 and 91. And that was sort of the long tail of that process. I think there are people that really know how to take construction risk well, and that would be the commercial banks. And there'll be a few of them that get over their skis and blow up, but by and large, they know what they're doing. The GSEs don't have that muscle memory. But what I think the GSEs could do, and I know that there are folks that have thought about this, what they could do is if it's brand new, attainable product, they could take stabilization risk. And rather than doing 90 for 90, maybe they commit earlier in the process. And the simple fact of doing that gives encouragement to the construction lender that they can actually, if they realize, look, I'm not really taking market risk, I'm just taking construction risk, they can actually lean into their construction loan a little bit, and the combination of those things may help you lower the cost of capital in a way that's productive. So I think there's a role for them to play. The bigger idea or riskier idea, or however you want to describe it, of them actually being involved in the construction process. Maybe I think there'll be some people that'll think it's overreach or a bridge too far. But as it relates to GSE reform in general, I've thought this when I was there, and I think it now. It's absolutely the right thing to do. It's been going on for 16 years. It's too long. I think the beneficiaries of release from conservatorship, I think the GSEs will be fully capitalized on their own probably by sometime in 27 or 28. The beneficiaries are, and this is not necessarily a position that other people would agree with, but I think the beneficiaries are the investors. Right now, what bond investors have is they have an implicit guarantee. That's what they have. Well, they would still have that if they're exited from conservatorship, plus they'd get the benefit of the PSPA, plus they would have additional private equity or private capital invested into the companies. So I think they're better off as it relates to the increased cost to consumers or the access orientation towards affordable and other mandates. There's no doubt there would probably be some increase in G fees required to make sure that the entities could earn the right cost of capital to attract capital. But the effect that has, notwithstanding the sort of dire predictions of people in the industry, the effect that would have on homeownership and access to capital for homeownership is zero. I mean,
when interest rates move hundreds of basis points month to month these days,
and there's the real life examples you remember from when you were there. 25 bip increase or 50, some substantial increase in the G fee in 2015, I think, or something like that. The effect on their market share, the effect on homeownership, zero. I mean, we've got real live examples of it, and at the current level of rates. I'm a little out of date on the numbers, but the percentage that the G fee represents of the cost of owning a home is like 1%, 1.5%. And that's basically it's like the oil in your engine, right? Oil doesn't cost that much, but you need to put it in your engine to make it work. And that's kind of the way I think about it.
Hugh, that brings up a great question, which is, we've been talking and I'm inspired in this conversation over supply, as we've been talking about. There's also, setting aside that, there's going to be that access to credit and equity question, wealth creation, and closing both the home ownership gap and the wealth gap that comes up. Obviously, setting aside the supply piece, based on what you just said, is there a role? The GSEs, haven't moved the needle tremendously over the last 30 years on the composition of the portfolio or the demographics, but you were there in the midst of tremendously turbulent times for a variety of things, and global pandemic, the George Floyd murder. Yep. You led through all of that. Coming out of all that and setting aside supply for a second, what is the view on how do we tackle this? How do we talk about it productively, getting home ownership and equity, the ownership economy, into the hands of more people?
There's a couple questions in there. One is, should we be as focused as we are on promoting home ownership, and is it actually a good way to generate wealth over time? It's a subsidized form of forced savings. If you were able to save and invest in a diversified portfolio in the equity and the bond markets, you do just as well as owning a house, especially if you look at the cost of maintenance. So that's kind of a bigger picture question, but I understand the emotional attachment to it. I think that there are people that would say promoting home ownership is a good thing because it promotes healthier communities. There's a whole bunch of societal and social things that people would say come from that. So again, that's maybe that's above my pay grade. So, but at the same time, if you think about how enormous the footprint of the federal government is in housing already, I'm just not sure that there's a lot. And the advocates who work on this every day wouldn't like me saying this, but I'm just not sure how much more you can do. You've already got, these are giant insurance companies. They already have cross subsidies. There are people that say the cross subsidies should be more. That's a question that policymakers will really have to wrestle with, because the set of conditions, and you correctly point out that since the Fair Housing Act of 1968, the homeownership gap has gotten worse, not better. Last time I looked, the challenges that have led us there, I don't think can be solved by financing alone. And as you also pointed out, the footprint of the federal government in residential housing has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. It's now 98% of all mortgages that are bought by an entity that's directly or indirectly subsidized by the federal government. And we haven't changed the problem at all. Maybe we've made it worse. And one could argue that adding that, and especially if supply has become more inelastic because of zoning and things like that, if we're just adding more demand-side subsidies, all we're doing is chasing our tail. We're just making it less and less affordable, which is why one of the reasons why during the pandemic, and especially after the murder of George Floyd, we focused on, are there things we can do to lower the cost of ownership without regard to the housing cycle? Are there costs that we can take out of the system? Now, of course, some of the things we suggested going after and did go after, you'd thought that we were trying to take people's children from them. That's just
my title away.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's just the nature of everybody. One thing I have learned from my time in Washington is that everybody deplores subsidies that they don't benefit from. And everybody likes subsidies that they do benefit from.
Well said.
Amen to that. Well, look, I mean, I think if we can fix the supply issue, we fix a lot of the other issues. But insofar as we don't fix the supply issue, we will continue to see inequities in who is able to access homeownership, and the limited supply will keep driving up home prices and will keep benefiting those who are able to access it. So I tend to agree, like, if we could solve the real problem here, we will solve the other problem. If we just try to solve the other problem, you run into this potentially dangerous situation where you're juicing demand and not really fixing the underlying supply issue. But putting that aside, Hugh, as expected, great conversation. I want to ask you one sort of last question, which you could relate to Vessel or just in general. But if you could wave a magic wand and make sort of one change in the industry, what would that sort of change? What's the biggest headwind you'd get rid of? What's your magic wand request?
We turn into Japan. And what I mean by that is we have a national zoning code. I mean, how did it, in 1910 or something, whatever it was, there were like 12 towns that had zoning codes. 10 years later, there were 1,200. And how is it possible that in many cases, unelected people at the local level who are incredibly hardworking and dedicated, but also incredibly self-interested, how is it possible that that is how the decisions on what is a national challenge, how is it that that's how those decisions are made? It'd be like if you said in the defense industry, if you sort of left the decision as to close, as to shut down a weapons system in the hands of the people in the town where the factory was. I don't know.
Yeah.
So the simplest thing would be, and again, this is sort of a Pollyanna-ish thing, but Japan has a national zoning code. That's what I would do.
They have so many interesting aspects of their housing market that are enviable here. And National Building Code would be also an interesting.
That would be good as well. And as it relates to this hasn't proven to be a challenge at Bessel yet, but I would also try to. I think some of the codes relating to and standards relating to manufactured housing in general are antiquated, and I know there's been a lot of work trying to fix that, and I would fix that too, because I think there is many people who live in manufactured homes as live in 50+ unit apartment buildings, and it's an important source of housing.
Well, thank you for joining us, Hugh. Thank you for your leadership. Again, this is inspiring, as I said before, and I really, really appreciate your time and your leadership and your vision. So we'll definitely have you back, but thank you so much for this conversation.
Thanks a lot. Good to be with you.
Appreciate you taking the time. Thanks to everyone who's listening. Please subscribe and pass this along to all your friends. We really appreciate it.